Um, Thank you for coming to this iteration of Beeper Seminar. Quite delighted to have a distinguished guest today, Sir Laurie Bristow, who has a remarkable career in the UK Foreign Service, having served previously as Her Majesty's ambassador at the time to Azerbaijan, and then to Russia. The very interesting time in Russia's history. It's really turning point, I think, the years that you were there from, I think, 2016 to 2020, right?
That's right. And 2007 to 10 as deputy.
Right. So, but also very interesting turning point. And then added to this, you had a period also in Kabul as British ambassador in Kabul during the fall of Kabul. So, uh, you can hardly get more excitement, I think, in your ambassadorial career than this. Sir Laurie is currently the president of Hughes College at Cambridge University. So, very warm welcome. Thank you for coming here today. We're discussing the Russia-Ukraine war and the way out. Is there a way out? When will this happen? How will this happen? Sir Laurie will have some prepared remarks, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation between the two of us, and then I'll open the floor up for general discussion. So look forward to it.
Well, thanks first of all, Sergey, for the invitation. We can lose the sir bit. We've got the formalities over. So it's great to be in Bologna, great to be back in Bologna. I was last here during the 1980s, which probably dates me. And it really kind of by accident, it's a pretty good week to be having this conversation. Although don't get too excited. I do not think that there's going to be a fully fledged peace deal and the world will all be fine again by this time next week. I think very far from that. So what I thought I'd do is I'll run through just some thoughts on both where we are, what happens next, but also just put out a few provocations, some of the sort of wider issues that we might touch on. So I'll run through this quite quickly. I've got reams and reams of notes here, but I won't use them all. So, I mean, first of all, start with the obvious. We're nearly 4 years in to the full-on invasion of Ukraine. As Sergey described, it's in my time working either in or on Russia. I've dealt with a number of invasions of Russia's neighbors, but also specifically for the UK, two poisonings. So the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko using polonium in 2006, and then, of course, I'm afraid my CV has plenty of these interesting moments on it. The poisoning of Sergei Skripal, the GRU officer, using a nerve agent in 2018. So, fourth anniversary coming up. We're probably 1.25 million Russian casualties down, killed or wounded. We think fewer on Ukraine's side, but of course appalling losses and millions of people displaced, either within Ukraine or beyond Ukraine's borders. The battle lines, if they even are lines anymore, actually they're more like zones, are very static, but immensely violent. And neither side, I think, is within sight of outright military victory anytime soon. So the point about an attritional war, which is what this has become, is that it's not really about who wins, it's about who loses faster. And at the moment, that I'm afraid is Ukraine by pretty much any measure. So moving on to the efforts for a ceasefire, we started the year with a new US president. That president believed that he could force a ceasefire pretty quickly on the participants. And he apparently believed he could do that within, as in his words, 24 hours. His negotiating strategy is, to say the least, unorthodox. Everyone will remember the strange meeting with Mr. Zelensky in the Oval Office back in February. He's at times cut off the supply of arms and intelligence, to the victim of the invasion, to try and force Zelensky into a quick deal. He's forced Zelensky into a minerals deal to try and bind in Ukraine to commercial relationships with the US, as if somehow the presence of US business interests might restrain Putin from invading again in the future. He's threatened Russia with sanctions and with supplying new military capabilities to Ukraine, but he's held back from really deeply intensifying the pressure on Russia. Instead, he seems to have pursued a course of personal engagement with Putin as a strategy for trying to get Putin to compromise. He is, of course, not the first Western leader to fall into this trap of believing that you can build a personal relationship with Putin. So we saw the Alaska summit. I was asked around that time by one of the foreign policy publications to have, they could produce 1,000 words by this time tomorrow on how to negotiate with Putin. My answer was, you can have 3 words now, not like this. Anyway, it happened. Then it appeared to be Trump appeared to be about to repeat the trick in Budapest, of all places, but backed off when the Russians made clear that their maximalist demands were still on the table. We then, of course, saw many of those maximalist demands appear in the 28-point plan cooked up between Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev. So the 28-point plan heavily reflected Russia's goals, took very little account of Ukraine's defensive needs, and completely sidelined the Europeans. This, of course, is important because it's Europe that will be compelled to accept much of the cost and the risk of implementation of any post-conflict arrangements, however they come about. Putin's negotiating strategy, I think, could hardly be clearer. It's of a piece with every negotiation I've ever seen him do. It's give away nothing, put pressure on the other side. He thinks Ukraine is losing, and he thinks that Trump is impatient for a deal. That, of course, I think is true, certainly as far as Mr. Trump is concerned. He's not, I think, interested in a negotiated peace on anything other than his own terms, which are pretty consistent with the reasons for the war starting in the first place. So if you're looking at this question from the point of view of how does a war end, I think it's always worth going back to how did it start? Why did it start? On that, I'll just run through a list of elements that essentially are my analysis of that question. So first of all, this is not about territory. It's not about the rights of Russians. Russians have no rights anywhere in the world, certainly not in the Donbass or Crimea. It's not about Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and it's not about neutralizing a genuine military threat to Russia from Ukraine or indeed from NATO. It's about Putin's idea of Russia and its place in the world. You can describe that view in any number of ways, but I think there are elements of imperialism in there, and there are certainly very, very large elements of great power rivalry, primarily with the US. The emotional dimension of foreign policy, I think, is always important. Even if you don't speak Russian, watch Mr. Putin speak. The anger comes through in every single sentence. It's about anger, it's about resentment of the world after 1991, including but not limited to NATO expansion, which is primarily about rolling back Russia's ability to impose a sphere of its own interests on its neighbors. And I think there is zero evidence that Mr. Putin's goals or view of the world will change anytime soon. That's a really key point if you're looking at what a negotiation might be about. So, some thoughts on the wider context. Where is Russia headed? Obviously, that's closely linked to what happens in Ukraine. I think there are really 2 big transition points, actually first-order transition points on the horizon, regardless of how the war ends. One is around the economy. I do not believe that the economy will break anytime soon in a way that will change Mr. Putin's options. But pretty clearly, the Russian economy, which is never a particularly strong point of that country, is going to face really the mother of all problems when it comes to unwinding the war economy, the extent to which the economy has become mortgaged to Putin's military objectives. The big one, though, is the leadership succession. Mr. Putin is 73 years old. For almost my entire time working in Russia, there was one great big problem that everybody knew about and nobody could talk about, and certainly nobody could answer. When the time comes, how are they going to do a stable, successful transition of power? And one of the problems here is that because institutions have been hollowed out and there are basically no rules other than what Mr. Putin says, there is no established model for how you do that when the time comes. One of the things I've taken to recommending, it's only half a joke. If you want to understand how power really works at that level in Russia, watch the film The Death of Stalin. That film came out while I was in Moscow. and it tells you pretty much what you need to know about the fears of the people at the top. It was banned in a few days in Russia. That, of course, has nothing to do with its portrayal of Stalin or of the people around him. It's everything to do with Russia as it happens now. So another big thing coming up is the role of China. So in my view, Russia fears China. Russians fear China. You don't need to travel very far outside the Garden Ring to find that out. And they have done for many years. And Sergei's most recent book explains a bit of why. I think China is somewhat embarrassed by the decision to invade. It's certainly embarrassed by Russia's failure to prevail, but not so embarrassed as to change the geopolitical fundamentals. So you hear from time to time a view in and around Washington that the answer to this war is to peel China and Russia apart. I think this is basically magical thinking. I think it's strategically illiterate. There is no world in which this is going to happen. Why not? Because Putin sees a US-led West as hostile. That isn't going to change. He sees the relationship with China as his main hedge against that. China, Xi Jinping, for his part, wants Russia as a wingman and a resource base in a competition with the US-led West. And I don't think there's anything that will really change those fundamentals. Third, the future of the rules-based international order. And this gets discussed a lot in policy circles and near policy circles. I think for these purposes, the basic thing just to hold on to here is that the rules-based international order was two things. One, it was very, very comfortable for the West post-1991, largely because it reflected our interests and to a large extent was created by us. The second thing is it's in the rearview mirror. So whatever we thought it is behind us, and we're going into a new world. The problem for the UK and the Europeans, many of them, is that we depend on rules, preferably ones of our own making, and they're central to how we think about security and stability. Increasingly, I'll put this out there as a provocation, Russia, for different reasons, China, and increasingly the US do not have compatible views of the rules-based international order. So the question for us is, how do we operate in a world of weak rules and rule-making by countries who do not share our interests or values? Fourth, linked to that, I think we're starting to come up now very hard against a question around the West's ability to rally around a coherent understanding of what is at stake here for the Atlantic Alliance. So it's been true for many years. European security is not the biggest issue in US foreign policy thinking, certainly not in domestic politics. That, of course, predates Donald Trump. Obama pivoted to Asia 15 years ago, over 15 years ago. What's startling about Trump, too, is his evident contempt for his European allies. What does that mean for the transatlantic relationship? So the future of the alliance, whatever the way this goes, is inseparable from Europe taking more responsibility for its own security. And the question of equitable burden sharing, more equitable burden sharing, has been out there since probably the 1970s, the 1980s in one form or another. Its absence, the absence of equitable burden sharing, is an open invitation to Mr. Putin to drive wedges between the Europeans and the Americans. So I think a major question for all of us over the next few years is whether US disengagement from Europe's security, which I think is now inevitable on both sides, is done or in a planned or a disorderly way. Further than this, though, the Atlantic Alliance was built around three pillars: political, military, economic, and values. I think the question is starting to arise as to whether there is now an unbridgeable values gap within and between the Western democracies. So to put it another way, is the US now meaningfully still part of the West? Whatever the answer, trust in the transatlantic relationship is visibly collapsing. Yet, as Europeans, we don't have a great deal of choice about who to work with. The US still has the ability to harness technology, cutting-edge technology, and the economic weight, which means that there are real hard limits to European strategic autonomy, while at the same time we're being required to exercise it. Let's pause very briefly on the broader effect of the erosion of trust in alliances and particularly in extended deterrence. I think we're now going into a period where it's highly likely that the arguments for nuclear proliferation will start to outweigh those against for a substantial number of middle powers. This, of course, has very profound implications for defense planning, resource allocation, risk management across a number of theaters. Last, but I think probably the most important of all, it's what's happening in our own societies, in the Western liberal democracies. We've got highly unstable and fluid politics. I think we're seeing probably the death of traditional conservatism, certainly in Europe, displaced by populist nationalist movements, with an unclear counteroffer by the democratic left. Martin Wolf, the Financial Times journalist, called it the crisis of democratic capitalism. Mr. Putin in 2019 put it rather more pithily in the Financial Times of all places. The liberal idea has outlived its usefulness. It has become obsolete. This is what he thinks, and I think there are a number of, on the face of it, democratic politicians who probably agree with him. So, prospects for current negotiations. Personally, I think a ceasefire, at least a ceasefire that is a real ceasefire, is both highly desirable and may even be achievable. I think probably more likely in 2026 than now in the remaining few weeks of 2025. Everyone except Putin wants a ceasefire. Putin, I think, wants a capitulation. Whether it's 28 points or 19 points or 10 points or however many points, I think the elements of a ceasefire are now pretty well known. There's a necessary precondition for a proper ceasefire, a real ceasefire. It's to convince Mr. Putin that his position will inevitably worsen over time unless he agrees to and implements, up to a point, a ceasefire. That, of course, requires coercion and the continued presence of coercion on Russia. Territory, I think, will be a key element of any ceasefire negotiations, and there may well be a territorial price for Ukraine to pay to achieve a ceasefire. But land for peace alone will not bring peace. This conflict isn't primarily about territory, so a real estate deal is not going to solve it. It may even make the situation worse if what it does is set the conditions for a renewed Russian attack, for example, by giving away the fortress belt in the Donbass. Security guarantees, on the other hand, are at the center of any viable ceasefire. This isn't about getting Russia to make binding promises. It's about creating facts that will deter Russia over time from attacking again. This is not something that in the real world you will agree with Russia, for the simple reason there is no world in which Mr. Putin will agree to be deterred. I mean, why on earth would he do that? He will want to impose measures of his own to deter others from coming in behind Ukraine if he chooses to attack again. So whenever we're talking about things like security forces, assurance forces, tripwire forces, there is a fundamental and at present unanswered question about what the purpose of those forces are, whether they're in Ukraine or whether they're just over the border in Poland or elsewhere. What do they do if Mr. Putin attacks again? Russia, of course, also has a number of political objectives. I mean, the list is quite long. I think the ones to focus on are regime change in Ukraine, binding commitments to close NATO's open door policy, above all, to reconfigure the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe to Russia's advantage. Money. The bill, the reconstruction bill for Ukraine is absolutely gigantic, even now. The only defensible answer to that question is that Russia pays. It is inconceivable that Russia will do so while Mr. Putin is in power, and I think it's also inconceivable that the United States will do so. So that's going to put intense pressure on European public finances. Sanctions and economic cooperation. It follows from everything I've said that any unwinding of sanctions should be conditional and reversible. Otherwise, basically, the sanctions will be lifted and Russia will do what Russia's going to do. I find the return to economic cooperation with Putin's Russia as the basis for peace to be, frankly, laughable. The West, and particularly Europe, my job description for many years was about building economic links with Putin's Russia. The idea was to bind Russia into a mutually advantageous cooperative economic relationship. It didn't work. Sequencing, of course, this is the kind of thing that people like me work on all the time. A ceasefire isn't the beginning of the end of a conflict. It's the beginning of the next phase of the underlying conflict. And in that sort of time-honored Russian way, a deal is not the end of a negotiation. It's the beginning of the next negotiation. So you just need to bear that in mind. It's always worth looking back over Minsk 1 and 2 and the way that the Kremlin played with things like the sequencing of the elements of that, particularly over who controls the border between Ukraine and the Donbass. The Kremlin's answer was, we do, and everything else happens first. That, of course, totally compromises Ukraine's sovereignty. Ambiguity and lack of precision. There are times in diplomacy when ambiguity is your friend. This is not one of them. If you leave things unspelled out in an agreement with Putin in a conflict of this time, this size, this magnitude, you're going to get what you deserve. So, you really need to pin things down early on. And last point, timescale. Timescales are really, really important in this war, as in any conflict resolution. I tend to think in terms of now 3 timescales. One is the one in which Mr. Trump is operating. That's about a week. He wants the dopamine hit, he wants the Nobel Prize, he wants whatever he wants, but he doesn't seem to me to think beyond the week after next, if that. I think for Putin, it's probably into next year. It's how to capitalize on the current circumstances, how to get a ceasefire that is actually essentially a US-led capitulation on Ukraine's behalf before the economic downturn in Russia really begins to bite, and before some of the social pressures start to hem Putin in. For the Europeans, for the UK, I would say for any serious planner about European defense, I think it's the next 5 or 10 years. Everything that I've said suggests that we're going to be living with this problem probably until Mr. Putin dies. I have no idea when that's going to be. I think we should assume that it may not be for the back end of this decade or the next one. This is, I'm afraid, what we've got, and no amount of wishing it away will change that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laurie. Thanks very much. Let us jump straight into a discussion, if I may. And I guess the first question I should probably turn this on so people online hear us. The first question I have for you is, let's look at the 28-point plan, which I think is dead by now. It doesn't seem like it's mentioned anymore. 19 points have been mentioned. We don't know exactly what they are. There has been a lot of criticism around this plan, not least the idea that perhaps it was written by the Russians. And it does sound like some parts of it reflect the Kremlin's talking point, but not all. To me, when I read this so-called plan, several things were obvious. First is that people who were writing it, many of them did not know what they were talking about, or whoever was writing it did not know what they were talking about. Partly because of errors in the wording. For example, in relation to the START treaty, which has long expired, you think, how on earth could they make these kinds of mistakes? There were also strange formulations and contradictory formulations in relation to the exchange of, or rather to the recognition of parts of territory that Russia has occupied. But also there were parts which I thought were not pre-approved by Moscow. One of those was the notion that Ukraine's army would be limited at 600,000 troops. Now, that is something that Russia is unlikely to, or Putin is unlikely to accept, because during the Istanbul talks in 2022, the Russian benchmark was 85,000, which is just a police force, really nothing else. Here we have 600,000, which actually is a major army. And there were a couple of other things that to me sounded like American efforts to pull the blanket away from Putin. Now, after the plan was released, Putin announced that it could serve as the basis for negotiations, which means presumably is that he was happy with bits of the plan, but he wants other concessions. Now, what happens then is the plan is obviously criticized by the Europeans and by the Ukrainians, and almost immediately there's some rollback that happens. We don't know exactly the shape of that rollback, but something has happened. So this is where we are at the moment. Presumably, the next stage is going to be to take this plan back to Moscow and get Moscow to sign on to this. In the circumstances where Putin is unlikely, and you said in your remarks that he's unlikely to want to end war except on his terms. Well, the plan that is going to be presented to him is unlikely to be his plan. Do you think he will accept it? Do you think he will use it as a basis of negotiation? Or will he simply use this to drag out the time and to then blame the Ukrainians for some, failure to accept terms while he's fighting on the ground?
Well, all of the above. I mean, my instant response on seeing the 28-point plan, I was in an event with the Centre for Geopolitics in Cambridge, and the thing was coming up on the screen as we were sitting there. The word I used was shameful, both in content and in the process that reached that. So you're right. There are some things in there that are just it's amateur hour. The reference to New START. I mean, they get the treaty wrong for a start. And there's a reference also to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't expire. It's a global treaty,
and it seems to assume that Ukraine is not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, yeah, which is another mistake. Yeah. Obviously, it has been since 1994.
So you can put some of those things, I think, to one side and just put it down to the rather strange negotiating format. I mean, bear in mind that you've got on the face of it the manager of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund up against a New York real estate agent. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, obviously, there's more going on in the background of that. The things that really caught my eye about that, though, were it was the way that the pieces did or didn't fit together. So I think we were all struck by the figure of 600,000 for the size of the Ukrainian army. 80,000, I mean, what Mr. Putin really wants is no Ukrainian army and no Ukrainian state, other than one that's been installed by the Kremlin. 80,000 is still bigger than the British army. I just sort of note I'm sort of going through, but the underlying. Well, we all bear these things. But I think the underlying point was that it offered no serious answer whatsoever to the question of how do you guarantee Ukraine's security under any kind of ceasefire deal. This is the most obvious fundamental point of all, because if you are fighting for your life, you're not going to stop fighting unless you're reasonably sure that the arrangements are what you need them to be. And that's a kind of inescapable point here. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why the process that essentially pushed Ukraine to one side for that phase of it was just so juvenile, because I mean it just circled around. It just didn't even address the most fundamental point of all. Essentially, what is the war about from Ukraine's perspective? I mean, there were some other things in there that I thought. It's a bit like when you lift up a stone and there are awful creepy crawlies running around. Some of the the provisions on economic cooperation between the United States and Russia, I think, told you an awful lot about where the thinking of the people around Mr. Trump really is. And if you've seen the article in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of days, I have no idea what the truth is behind that article. But if only a small proportion of it is true, it's very, very ugly indeed. Because basically it looks on the war as an opportunity for a commercial transaction on behalf of the US. So I suggest you read the article and form your own views about it. But I mean, coming back to your point about what's Mr. Putin's approach on this, I mean, I think there have been a number of things going on, really from the point in late 22, early 2023, where we were over the initial disaster of Russia's opening military campaign, and we were over the Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainian counterattack failed, essentially. And at that point, I think the war morphed into one of those things where I'm trying to get inside Mr. Putin's mentality here. If you string this out for long enough, you can't lose, either militarily or politically. And with Mr. Trump in the White House, a large part of that is about making sure that the Ukrainians are taking the blame for the war not ending. And there's a lot of that, I think, going on, because, of course, what follows from that is whether or not the US administration not even so much actively supports the Ukrainians, but actively undermines the Ukrainians. I mean, that I think is now a serious possibility here. as I said, I don't think that in Mr. Putin's thinking the Europeans count very much in all of this, but in practice, I'm afraid we do, because it's much closer and much much more immediate for us than it is for people on the other side of the Atlantic.
So, well, thank you for that. I'll let me challenge you on a couple of things. I'll serve as a devil's advocate here. So first, on this question of economic cooperation with Russia, I read the Wall Street Journal article, and it was disturbing in many ways. But I thought that some of the examples that were presented there as aspirations of certain American companies to re-enter the Russian market were completely unrealistic. For example, the idea that an American company buys Nord Stream 2 and then does exactly what? Exports gas to Europe, and the Europeans are going to say, yes, of course, we will buy this gas, right? Despite saying that they will phase out reliance on Russian gas in the near future. So some of those things actually show that the Europeans could have real leverage. If American companies enter the Russian market, they could be, for example, sanctioned. Do you think that's a possibility for the European Union to come up with secondary sanctions on American companies, or is that beyond the pale? Is that beyond the pale at this stage? Now, where I wanted to challenge you is the question of security guarantees. And here's the interesting thing with security guarantees. What have we learned from the last 4 years, practically 4 years of fighting? It is that for the United States, much as for the West and certainly for the Europeans, the number one priority in this war is not Ukraine's victory. It is clear that the number one priority is avoiding a nuclear conflict with Russia. And we saw that very clearly with the way that the Biden administration very slowly probed those red lines to see where they are, if they exist at all, and showed no desire whatsoever to escalate with Russia or even offer viable security guarantees to Ukraine. If that was the case for the last 4 years, what makes us think that any future security guarantees would actually be, first of all, that viable security guarantees would be offered, i.e. Article 5 level? But actually, if you read Article 5, it shows that Article 5 can be interpreted in any number of ways, and anybody's guess is what happens if the Russians invade Estonia, for example, whether it actually leads to active NATO intervention or American intervention in defense of Estonia. But what would make us think that those security guarantees, whatever is written in the paper, would actually be worth the paper they're written on in case of Russia's reinvasion, given the Western reluctance in actually getting boots on the ground? And in that context, actually, I'm surprised by the Ukrainians, who seem to be so doggedly determined to extract what they see as reliable guarantees, even though they would be on paper. That's why I think actually investing in one's army, and this is what Naftali Bennett used to tell Zelensky, right? Invest in your army, the Israeli model, which I think, by the way, doesn't apply to Ukraine because it doesn't have nuclear weapons, and also its neighbors, Russia, and not, let's say, the neighbors of Israel. So the Israeli model doesn't work. But still, this is the viable way to defend Ukraine, and not the hope that the UK will come to its rescue, or France with its nuclear bomb will come to its rescue, or even the Germans, or even the United States.
Wow, there's a lot of questions in there. So first of all, I mean, US companies, I'll pick up your question about, would Europe conceivably sanction US companies operating in Russia? I have considerable doubts about that. The reality, the political and economic reality of pretty much any European country's relationship with the United States means that this is where your diplomats really seriously get to work, and you do whatever's necessary to neutralize the problem. And by the way, just on that, I mean, it's been a bit of a case study over the last 9 months of just what it takes, to maintain a functional political relationship with Washington. I mean, I really take my hat off to some of my former colleagues in government for doing things that, are maybe frankly slightly demeaning. But it comes back to the size and centrality of the relationship with the US for any UK government, regardless of who's in the White House. Economic, political, military, security, the whole lot. There just isn't, an alternative elsewhere, for us at least. Or just briefly on US companies. Well, it's just worth bearing in mind some of the facts. The economic relationship that the Europeans, the UK, had with Russia before 2022 was an order of magnitude larger than that American companies had with Russia. If you put aside the oil and gas sector, where you've got sort of ExxonMobil in a kind of league of its own, I think the question there really comes down to the balance of risk and reward. Russia seems to me, for the foreseeable future, to be off-scale risk with highly uncertain reward. And if I were advising any corporate, should I go into Russia, the answer would be, are you joking? That there is almost any other market is likely to offer a better risk-reward ratio while Mr. Putin is in charge and Russia is the way it is. Security guarantee. So what have we learned? By the way, I think you're right. I mean, the number one priority, rightly, throughout the last 3.5 years has been avoidance of war directly between NATO and Russia on both sides. And the conclusion I draw from that period is that nuclear deterrence works. And it worked on both sides. It's a very unpleasant thing to contemplate because, well, first of all, it's a bit sort of politically incorrect to say so. But there are good reasons why it's been in neither the West's interest, NATO's interests, nor in Russia's interests for this to become a direct military confrontation. All our military planners do the modeling, and it's not hard to work out where this goes once you're on that escalation ladder, and just how difficult it is to get off that escalation ladder. On the other side, I think we've learned an awful lot about how deterrence really works in the last 3.5 years. So when I was still in government at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were discussions that were very, very scary about should we provide this capability or that capability. And of course, the messaging coming back from Russia was, if you provide anti-tank weapons, we're at war. If you provide F-16s, we're at war. If you supply Storm Shadow cruise missiles, we're at war. If you share intelligence targeting data, we're at war. If you supply ATACMS, the battlefield missiles, we're at war, and so on and so on. We're not at war. We're arguably, Mr. Putin would say we're in a proxy war, but that's not the same thing at all. So the conclusion I draw from that is, don't think about this in terms of how do you put in more and more and more piecemeal capabilities. Think about what you're trying to achieve. What is the purpose of this support? The purpose of the support is not to enable Ukraine to fight back to its internationally recognized borders. You may need to say that is the ultimate objectives, but it's not possible. It isn't possible from where we are now. The objective is to get to the point where Mr. Putin knows he cannot win militarily, and that will get worse over time. That's the entry point to a proper negotiation about a ceasefire. It won't solve the underlying conflict, but it may get you to a point where both sides can agree that there is more to gain than to lose from calling a halt to hostilities. The whole point about Article 5 and this stuff, I find there's an area of an air of unreality about some of these discussions. There is no way that NATO will come to a consensus to admit Ukraine. I mean, one of the origins of the problem was the Bucharest summit. I was in Moscow at the time, the 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO couldn't agree what to say about Ukraine's and Georgia's membership. So what we agreed is to say that they will one day become members.
But do you think it was a good idea, the way it played out?
No, I think what happened at Bucharest was a terrible idea. I mean, you either say it and do it, or you say nothing. I mean, it's kind of the first rule of diplomacy. Don't say something that you're not prepared to back up.
By the way, what was the UK position on this? Because we know the Americans were pushing for it, the Germans were resisting this, and then as a result, you have that bizarre compromise. What was the UK position?
So the German and the French position was dead against, and the UK, as quite often happens, was trying to tack very close to the Americans. So my memory of it was that we had quite serious reservations about just how this might actually work in practice, whether this is a good idea now to push this question. And of course, the main focus at the time was on Georgia rather than on Ukraine. That the kind of language that tries to sort of maneuver around a question of such first order magnitude for everyone involved, it just didn't strike me as a smart thing to do. Other strategies, I think, my answer would be start with the facts. It's very unlikely that an Article 5 guarantee will be extended to Ukraine. It's even more unlikely that Mr. Putin will believe it if it is. And the whole point about Article 5 is that your prospective opponent has to believe it's true. I mean, again, this is not a new problem. This goes way back into the Cold War.
Or at least be uncertain as to whether it will be
exactly, but to be in that sort of margin where it's you're constrained because you don't actually know how an adversary would respond. So that leaves you with the obvious strategy, which is the porcupine. If you think that as Ukraine you're going to need to fight off Russian aggression for the foreseeable future, the way you do that is by creating military facts and political facts that take you back to that incentive structure, where it's just not worth it for the Kremlin.
Yes, fascinating. On Article 5, I was struck by the way that the Ukrainians wanted language that was actually much more explicit than Article 5 during the Istanbul negotiations. And the Russians kind of agreed to that, except they inserted a proposition which will give them the right to veto any application of this measure. So that was in Istanbul, which I guess is kind of interesting. But anyway, so yeah, we don't know what is being discussed now in this plan, because their security guarantees were mentioned, but I just cannot imagine under what circumstances the United States would actually be willing to commit to viable outside Article 5 language, outside of accepting Ukraine to NATO, which, as you rightly say, is unlikely, but on a bilateral basis also seems unlikely. Which American voter will support that idea of bringing Americans actually on the ground to fight in Ukraine? That seems to be an unrealized plan.
So this was what I was getting at when I was talking about the ambiguity and imprecision of some of the language. When you are potentially committing military forces to a problem of this magnitude, if you only be ambiguous if you really intend to be ambiguous and you think it's a good idea. I mean, I couldn't even actually understand in the 28 points what the document was even saying. So who is exactly doing what, with whom, and who's paying for it?
Well, the hilarious article, and I don't know if any of you who have not read this document should read it, but the most hilarious bit was where the United States encourages, there's going to be discussion between NATO and Russia about the architecture of post-war Europe, which will be facilitated by the moderated by the United States, which is so strange, because obviously the United States is part of NATO. So what exactly is going on there?
But for what it's worth, I thought there were probably two interesting things going on in there. One, on the American side, was the way that the Trump administration has positioned itself on the Gaza deal, so basically standing above it. But the point that you mentioned about Russian vetoes and all the rest of it, it's just worth looking back over the now quite long history of the Kremlin's ambitions to create a new European security architecture, or a new old European security architecture, in which they have a veto over everything. I mean, this is the whole point of the rather strange and short-lived Medvedev European Security Treaty that was launched in 2009, I think. And we all burst out laughing and said, thanks, but we're not buying. Maybe we should have engaged them in discussion on that.
Do you think the rollback of NATO, the kind of rollback that they indicated in those memorandums of December 2021, is still a motivating factor? Is it something they want to accomplish or not, or is it just propaganda?
Oh yes, it's certainly something that they want to accomplish. So I have a sort of a sort of golden rule of working on Russia if you're in government. If you want to know what Mr. Putin thinks, listen to what he's saying. On the whole, he's telling you. You may not like what he's telling you. You certainly won't like the implications of that. But those two treaties, this was about maybe a few weeks before the invasion.
Yeah.
It was a draft treaty with NATO. We weren't expecting this to go blur on the desk like that. What it basically said is that NATO will withdraw to its 1997 dispositions. This is, of course, all about not 1 inch and about not putting any permanent NATO combat forces east of the old Cold War borders. What it's really about is US disengagement from European security. That's the underlying thing here. And that, of course, goes back to the 80s and beyond.
Yeah, well, this is the longest standing position of Russian and Soviet foreign policy to break up NATO, to get the US out, to also break up the European Union. I don't think that has changed. Final question for me.
Just to drop in an anecdote. One of the, since I'm out of government, I mean, I can talk about those things. So I was ambassador in Moscow when the Russians basically they developed and started deploying a missile called the 9M729. And you know all about this missile. I'm guessing there are other people in the room who do as well. The whole point of this missile was that it basically destroyed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So I'm looking at the sort of guessing the average age around the room. I'm getting a similar vibe to what I was getting in my morning meetings in the embassy in 2018, 2019, where I'm going on about these missiles and the Euro missiles crisis of the 1980s, which I lived through. This is when we had Soviet SS-20s. With the point of the missiles is that you can go to nuclear war in Europe without it involving the Soviet Union and the United States. That's basically the principle here. The NATO response was cruise and Pershing missiles, which of course brought out people protesting in the UK, in Germany, in Italy, in a number of, I think the Netherlands, maybe 1 or 2 others, not against the SS-20s, but against the cruise and the Pershings. So as a political maneuver, it did its job. It was pulling apart the European and the US parts of NATO. The point about the treaty was that this very, very dangerous situation with these missiles with flight times measured in a few minutes, so your decision time in a crisis may be down to not many seconds, abolished the whole lot. There's an entire class of weapons was abolished under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. When I was explaining to my staff why this was probably about the biggest thing that we would deal with in our time in Moscow, they were all looking back at me like this, saying, "What are you talking about? This is 1980s business." It's not.
I mean, it's fascinating, of course, and this, sometimes I do wonder about the INF Treaty, obviously concluded in 1987, seen as a major turning point, abolition of one major class of missiles, hailed widely at that time. And now we don't have it anymore, right? We don't have. The Russians are developing missiles. The Oreshnik missile is some kind of something similar or something in the INF range anyway. And you look back on this and you think, how did all of this happen? And do the Russians bear all of the responsibility, or is the responsibility shared? For example, you might argue that American withdrawal from the ABM treaty was also inappropriate in the early 2000s. What would you say to that? Do you think is it a situation of taking 2 to tango, or should we just sort of say, well, the Russians were revisionist with all of that from the start?
It's a really, really good question. And I think in the interests of intellectual honesty, it is worth looking back at the paths that we in the West did tread, and whether, at the very least, we hadn't thought through how they would be read by the other side. So the ABM treaty, the withdrawal from the ABM treaty, and then what was known at the time as theater missile defense, basically putting in very, very limited defenses against rogue missiles from Iran was, of course, the major target at the time. I mean, the Kremlin were telling us loud and clear at the time, this concerns us. Actually, they weren't that vocal about the withdrawal from the ABM treaty. They were very, very vocal about missile defense, because apart from anything else, the location of the launchers and the radars in Poland and Romania in particular. And what they were saying to us was this holds at risk our ability to hold you at risk in a crisis. Not the words they were using, but that's what they were saying. To which our response was, don't be, just be serious, will you? I mean, we're not planning to go to war with you. And by the way, if you look at the physics of how these things work, you can't actually shoot down an ICBM with theater missile defense located in Central Eastern Europe. And I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier on. It's about just not listening hard enough to the messages you're being sent by your counterparts. They may be right, they may be wrong, factually, but they're telling you what they think. So it's maybe a good idea to listen.
But there's also a fascinating point that you raised in your presentation, and when you talked about Putin's anger and resentment as a driving motivation for his actions. And sometimes you look at some of these decisions that he makes and interpretations that he makes, and I think it's almost appropriate to conclude that he resents NATO enlargement not for, let's say, the security threat that it potentially has for Russia, but because it symbolizes something to him that he feels great resentment about. And the same could probably be said about the interceptors in Central and Eastern Europe. They symbolize something, or symbolized at the time, because they were never implemented. Obama canceled the program, but they symbolize something to him that to him was something that he just couldn't accept because it's, he was angry about it. Would you think that is the reason for his actions?
It's not the whole reason, but I think there's a really important insight in there. So, I mean, you're mentioning Obama. It reminds me of something that Obama said about, I can't remember the exact date, but it was, he described Russia as a regional power. I was in Moscow at the time, and I'm thinking, I wish you hadn't said that. Not because I necessarily disagree with the analysis. I mean, it's debatable at least. But as an exercise in political psychology, you've just basically required Mr. Putin to prove that actually Russia is a great power.
I think you're right. I think this was so inappropriate on his part, as was his comment about Putin being the kid in the back of the classroom, etc. Things like that. You think, why
did you do that?
Why did you do that? It's insane. And you're dealing with a guy who has massive power and is clearly in a vengeful, resentful mood, and you sort of just keep saying those things.
I think there's a very important sort of point of sort of geopolitics in here as well, and it comes down to incompatible views of actually how the modern world works. So maybe illustrate it with an anecdote. I won't name the guy, although we were chatting about him just before we started. In about 2009, I was in a meeting with a visitor from London with a very, very high profile and well-known Russian political commentator. It's called a politolog in Russian. It was things were going quite badly between the UK and Russia, nothing new in that, and things were going quite badly, or increasingly badly, between Russia and the West. This was after the invasion of Georgia, all the rest of it in 2008, and we were chatting about, I think it was the OSCE and the security order in Europe, and this guy basically looked at us and smiled the smile of a crocodile, and said, "We're having this discussion as if we both believed that large countries, great powers, and small countries had the same rights. And we both know this isn't true, don't we?" My visitor from London and I looked at each other and said, "Did he just say that?" He did. I mean, this is the whole point of he was challenging us. It really in-your-face aggression. So what he'd just done was tip over the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter for a New Europe, the whole basis of the European Union, and a few other things besides. And he just wanted to see how he reacted. But the point is that in his world, there are great powers and there are lesser powers. There are three great powers: Russia, the United States, and China. The UK is not a great power, and they delighted in reminding me of that from time to time.
Well, they're obsessed with the UK, right? They think that the UK runs the world practically. The Anglo-Saxons, etc.
Well, I think they think that MI6 runs the world, or more to the point, runs the Americans. But we won't disabuse them of that. But
Yeah, well, thank you for this remarks. Let's open the floor to questions. Oh, we've got lots of questions. Okay, there we go. Let's start at the front. I'll just follow. Let's collect questions in threes, I suppose. Probably the best way of doing this. If there's anybody online, please post your questions there. I'm able to see that. So please identify yourself, Alex.
Hello, my name is Alexander Schreier. Oops. Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I wanted to touch more on the Europeans because they've truly been sidelined so much in these negotiations. And I read a recent article in the FT that says, they do have some leverage in the Russian assets, and Belgium, is being very difficult right now in allowing the Russian assets to be given as a loan, I believe, to Ukraine. How do the Europeans increase their leverage to get a voice in these negotiations? Thank you.
All right, let's have another one. Go over there.
Thanks, sir. My name's Jason. I'm a first-year master here. I have two questions, so that's all right, Professor. But so my first one's so you talked about the security imbalance between Europe and the United States. Isn't it better for Europe to handle its own defense, especially with your points about kind of Europe and the US drifting apart values-wise? So would it be better if Europe does indeed have different values than the United States to handle its own defense? And then as a follow-up to that, when I was in the Army and we would train with European forces, what always happened eventually was we would just talk about each other's countries and who was better and who was worse. And Europeans every single time would bemoan the fact that they think that the youth of Europe is weak, and that they don't like to do things or they don't like to get dirty. They don't like to do manual labor. They don't like to do any of the things that usually you would associate with people wanting to join the army. And so do you think that any of the defense goals that European nations have set to kind of post-Ukraine war to build up their militaries are actually feasible, given the lack of kind of will to follow up with them from European populations? As of right now, it looks like that all the goals that Germany, for instance, is going to set for its army aren't going to be hit because nobody actually wants to join the German army.
All right, thanks, Jason. Do that. Okay, with Ian. Okay.
Good evening, Ambassador, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ian. I'm a second-year student here. And my question is, how much longer do you believe that Russia can hold out in this situation of attrition? I think it's quite obvious that they have the numbers to do so longer than Ukraine, but I'm still wondering how much longer, in your estimation, they can hold out. And to that end, how much more cost can they accrue, and what are those primary points of pressure? And on that same line of thinking, are we actually at a point where negotiations make sense, or is it actually too early, realistically?
All right, thank you. Well,
Wow.
3 questions.
Where to start? Okay, I'll maybe chuck a few things in there. You'll I think probably need to pitch some of your own in on some of those. Okay. How to European leverage. So the point about the seized assets, I mean, for those who don't follow this stuff in detail, there's very large numbers of Russian state assets held in Euroclear, in largely Belgium, a few other places besides. And the proposition still on the table is not to confiscate those assets, which of course is a somewhat troubling legal precedent. If as with most European countries or the UK or the US, you've got state and private assets basically invested all over the world. You don't really want to set that precedent. Broadly speaking, what was proposed there is to use those assets to back, basically to guarantee a loan to the Ukrainians against eventual either confiscation or payment of reparations by Russia. So you're kind of putting that bit off into the future. The Belgians, bless them, were worried that they will be left holding all the political and potentially legal risk for this. That argument has to be won. There are lots of very elegant lawyers working on that one. But the underlying principle is that there are not many pockets of 100, 200 billion euros around the system that you can apply to this problem. And that, I'm afraid, is one of them. Better for Europe to handle its own defense. Yes, but I mean, we touched very briefly. We might come back onto some of the extent to which some of these questions really are not new. They're just very, very acute now because of the nature of this this war, and also what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic politically, and therefore between the Atlantic allies. Europe as a whole, going back to the post-1945 era, did this kind of deal with the Americans. I mean, it used to be described as keeping, the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. You can play around with the words here, but there are still elements of that going on. I think the bits of this that are interesting is how far is it reasonable, how far is it politically wise to expect any American administration, given the domestic pressures that any US administration, it isn't just about Trump, will be under, and the fact that the US has interests in the world other than in Europe. How far is it reasonable to expect the US to prepare to shoulder a disproportionate share of the cost and risk of defending Europe? I mean, I think the question contains its own answers. In Europe, we've got to do better. That involves spending a lot more money. It depends also on building the case with our societies that we have to do better with all of the things that implies. I'll just come back in a second, though, to a point about that. I think for all concerned, there's a point here also about the purpose of alliances. On the whole, you don't form alliances because you're feeling beneficent to your allies. You form them because it's in your long-term interests. And whether you're looking at a very tight, structured alliance like NATO or some of the looser arrangements elsewhere in the world, it is, I would say, to the US's benefit to have allies. I mean, full disclosure, I worked on the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Looking back on it, it wasn't a terribly good idea, and the consequences were pretty disastrous. And of course, I was at the end in Afghanistan, where both politically and militarily, it benefited the United States a lot to be able to work with allies, including both in political terms, but also in military terms, because one of the points about NATO is that you train together and you operate together, and that's so you can bring capabilities to bear or spread risk, these kinds of things. How much longer can Russia hold out? I think there are a few factors here. The short answer is as long as Putin needs to. And the idea that the economy will collapse and that will somehow take the problem off the table for us, I don't think this is realistic. Sasha Prokopenko, a very, very good economist now based in Berlin, has done a lot of very interesting work on this.
We were very fortunate to have her in my Russia class a couple of weeks ago. So she was here.
Yeah. She's just brought a book out.
She did an excellent book. It's a great book.
Yeah. So I think that what I would pull out of there is that you're trying to achieve a couple of things here through sanctions and through arming the Ukrainians. First of all, it's to sharpen and bring forward the really, really big dilemmas that the Kremlin either faces now or will face soon. Forced choices about where its money goes, how it maintains elite stability, elite cohesion, how it maintains social stability. The Kremlin will apply enough violence to the problem in the short term to achieve societal agreement. What they can't solve is the long-term problem they have is that one day in the not too distant future, they've got to do that transition of power. So they will want this question off the table, resolved well before that, because while this is going on, you can't really think seriously about that. Just coming back to public support for the military. So I can only really speak for the UK on this and my observation of other countries. But I think some things are changing. Germany, the Zeitenwende in 2022, don't underestimate how big a sort of screeching handbrake turn this was, both on military expenditure, but also a very, very fast and disorderly disengagement from particularly Russian piped gas. In the UK, I've been privileged to work alongside our military in some very difficult environments. I think it would be very unwise to assume that you can't sell this proposition to the public. In the UK, it's not quite comparable with the US, but the admiration for what our military did in very difficult circumstances in the fall of Kabul and even before that in the sort of strategic disaster that was the Helmand campaign. There's a lot of political capital there that the military can draw on. So I just wouldn't assume that it's hopeless and it can't be done. It can be done if you go about it the right way.
All right. Well, do we have further questions? Okay, get some people in the back.
Hello. Hi, I'm DJ. I have a question about the sort of economic separation of Europe writ large, and Russia since the war. In the event that the war concludes, as you said, in 2026 or beyond, how much longer does the separation outlast the war? Is, I guess, in my view, that there was a lot of progress on cutting relations between unsavory characters in Russia and the European and American economies and such. How much longer is that going to last post-war? Yeah. So thank you.
Good question. I think the Russians certainly expect the German industry to put pressure on the German government to reopen the market for Russian gas. Is that coming?
Yeah. It might do. I'm just going back to something that somebody asked earlier on about the Americans. It's just worth bearing in mind that actually the biggest exporter of hydrocarbons in the world today is the United States. So I mean, obviously, shale gas shipped across the Atlantic is rather more expensive than Urals gas shipped through a pipeline. But I don't see any US administration surrendering that market position lightly. I mean, why would they? I think for me, I mean, as always, I mean, companies take their commercial decisions based on their understanding of the risk-reward ratio. What I suspect just happened, what I rather hope just happened, is that over the last 3.5 years, the scale of the losses that some European companies and some American companies incurred basically from forced sales of their assets in Russia should cause them to rethink. Before you go back in, are you sure that you're not going to see this film again? So if nothing fundamental has changed about the way Russia works, it's still working on the same basis under the same people, which means essentially the rule of law, forget it. It's good old Soviet legalism. The law means whatever we need it to mean. If that means we're going to expropriate you, well, we're going to expropriate you. And of course, there are examples of that happening before, well before the current crisis as well. The other thing just in play here also, though, is public acceptance. So if you look at the market pressures on corporates from, for example, climate or ESG or Gaza or take your pick, a company can easily destroy its own franchise by doing things that the public won't accept. And again, I think given what we've seen, this the scale of the war crimes in Ukraine, the scale of the dislocation. I mean, basically anyone who lives in Europe knows Ukrainians who've been displaced by the war. I think it's just something to pause over before you take that decision to jump back into the Russian market.
Yeah, and the Russians, of course, celebrate every time this happens. There's some Italian companies that try to reopen presence in Russia, and the Russian propaganda went all ballistic over this. Look at this, they're coming back. But I think you're right. I think they won't, and that's why this Wall Street Journal article is so off target in many respects. I think you're exactly right. Questions? Okay, we have somebody in the back as well. Let's go a couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Mike's here.
I guess I do have the microphone. Hi, my name is Henry Lever. I'm a second-year student. I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. I had a quick question about Tomahawk cruise missiles. In your estimation, is it unwise to provide Ukraine with the tools and permissions to strike more deeply into Russia?
All right. There's a question in the back as well. Okay. Okay. Technical problem.
Yeah, talking about as one block, I say the kids one thing for you to another thing. What are you're going to be the that's that we need to make for one big voice in all this, and what are the risks, the downfalls that we see on not having the European voice in the country
Make Orban an offer he cannot refuse.
I'll go with that.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so Europe. I'm tempted to ask you to turn the mic off. Tomahawk first. I mean, part of the answer is that we've been round this circle again and again and again. I touched on it earlier. It was main battle tanks at one stage. Storm Shadow missiles. What's the German one called?
Taurus.
Taurus. That's it. So, I mean, I can quite, without too much difficulty, persuade myself that Tomahawks are probably a little bit different because of their history and what they were actually created to do. I mean, it goes back to the INF Treaty and the way that they're understood in the Kremlin. If the question is more about the Ukrainians conducting deep strikes, well, they're doing it anyway. They're doing it anyway with drones. And there's a very interesting point here, by the way, about the volume of defense material that is now produced by Ukrainians in Ukraine. Depending on how you measure it, it's about half. I'm not sure whether that's by value or volume or whatever. But the Ukrainians, it seems to me, have come across, they've worked out a strategically very, very smart way of countering what the Russians were doing already to their own energy infrastructure, which is go after Russian energy infrastructure. This is, after all, part of the, we call it the military-industrial complex in Russia. It helps you to sharpen those non-military dilemmas that the Kremlin's dealing with. Good luck to them on that. I would just be a little bit cautious, though, about the sort of political resonance of something like Tomahawks. You can maybe achieve the same thing in slightly different ways. As I understand it, the most important bit of all is which part of the refinery to hit, not what you hit it with. And of course, these brilliant operations like Spiderweb, the ones where the drones came out of the top of the trucks, and all of a sudden the entire trucking sector in Russia closed down because they had to stop trucks and open them up and see what was in them. Europeans acting as a single bloc. Well, bear in mind that you have sitting in front of you a former UK diplomat. There is no way of avoiding this point that one of the two most capable military powers in Europe voted to turn its back on one of the most important, probably I would say the most important political and economic structure for European integration and thinking about European integration. You ask the voters, you've got to accept the answer, even if you think it was the wrong answer. How to get to one European voice? So the place to start is for everyone to come to a single European understanding of what is at stake here. And I put it in really, really crisp terms. If Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia is the dominant military power in Europe. Good luck with that. So I think there's a really important point here about the terms in which both the governments and the publics understand what this war is about for us. Not for Ukraine, that's an important part of it, for us. And that, I think, should help you with things like defense expenditure, defense capabilities, doing away with some of the nonsenses around procurement, and also, I think, takes you into a rather more sophisticated discussion with the Americans. So what does proper, actual, serious burden sharing look like in an alliance context? Not how many pounds or dollars or euros do we spend, but how does the alliance fit together? And there are some capabilities that it will be essentially next to impossible for Europe to replicate in a meaningful timescale here, even if we thought it was a good idea. So I think it is trying to move the discussion beyond that. How do we assure everybody's security in an alliance that's changing? That seems to me to be a conversation worth getting into. Mm-hmm. But you've got to put money on the table to do that. Mm. Yep.
Whether Russia might actually participate in the vehicle that is something that India makes clear that they constantly talking that Russia might be ready to participate with fighters for example. last year. So my question is, besides continuing to have this conversation, but what you think is actually, regardless of what happens, like once Russia really put us first of all, I think that
Thank you. The questions don't really come much bigger than this. And again, I flip round the answer from how do you fight a war with Russia to how do you not fight a war with Russia? This is the whole point, isn't it? I mean, you want to deter a war rather than fight one. But if you fail to deter, you're going to have to fight one. I mean, that I'm afraid is the conundrum that we're all facing. I forget who the quote is from. You know, if you want peace, prepare for war. And I think that's what's going on with the various military leaders. There was I think the French chief of defense staff said something similar a week or so ago, and from time to time generals in the UK do as well. But it does come back to this point about, you know, if you do not want to go to war, what does it take for that to happen? And I think that really helps in terms of you know, thinking things through. So obviously everybody's very concerned about the costs. You know, we've all got public finances are under extreme strain. The cost of operating effectively as an alliance, even an alliance where, you know, you can no longer rely on the presence of US capabilities in the way that we maybe hoped we could in the past. You know, the cost of doing that as an alliance is rather less than the cost of trying to do it all individually. So there's a point about it. There is also here, I think, a point about how do you respond to provocations? So the one that was in the news a month or so ago was overflights of Poland and the Baltic republics. So there's a really important point here, which is that you don't necessarily get a choice about whether the Russians conduct that kind of provocation. You do get a choice about how you react to it. If anyone's interested in how the sort of psychology of this works, go and look up reflexive control. I've had it done to me a number of times by the Russian state. Basically, they poke you with a stick because they know how you'll react, and that's the reaction they want. So it's you know, when you've got, for example, drones flying over your airspace, you don't necessarily need to shoot them down. Bear in mind that drone is probably worth a couple of $1,000s, and the missile you're firing at it may be worth 3 million, and you haven't got many of them. I mean, in effect, if you launch off a missile at the drone, that's job done. So you've wasted a missile and you've scared your public. So, you know, all in all, a pretty bad day's work. If you shoot down a piloted aircraft, that's a really, really, really big deal, even if it shouldn't have been there in the first place. So my suggestion here is, if you're thinking about your policy responses, work out what works for you and works against Russian interests and do that, rather than just instantly, you know, going for the reflex.
So just to follow up on this, on the fighter aircraft, we had the intrusion into Estonian airspace recently. This sort of thing happened during the Cold War, and when this happened to the Russians always shot them down. So you had overflights of U-2s that were, you know, Gary Powers is the most infamous incident, of course, was not even a military aircraft at all, and this is KL-007 on September 1st, 1983, which was shot down, although it was a civilian aircraft that intruded into Soviet airspace. Would you not say that the Russian expectation is precisely that we do not shoot them down, and that's why they will continue doing this? But if we actually shoot them down, they'll learn the lesson and they will not send expensive aircraft into our airspace.
Well, of course, that's pretty much what happened with the Turks in, was it 2015?
2015, yeah.
You know, when it was obviously it was after the Russian intervention to support Assad, and you know, I spent 3 years in Turkey at the UK embassy there. The Turks don't muck around with this kind of thing, and what was happening was very, very high-speed overflights of bits of complex geography, bits of Turkish territory. And the Turks said to the Russians, if you do this again, we'll shoot it down. So the Russians did, obviously, I would say deliberately, so the Turks did.
And there have not been any overflights?
Yeah, there haven't been any overflights since. It was a fairly anxious few weeks while that was worked out. I think, though, in this case, the context is different. So an expeditionary force operating in Syria overflying bits of Turkish territory, I think is not the same as what the Russians would consider to be NATO heartland at a time of intense tension between Russia and NATO. So, the chair of the military committee was talking about this, I think, yesterday or the day before. What I'm saying is it may be the right thing to do it. It may be the right thing to find a different way of making your point. What you do, though, is you make your point, you impose a cost, preferably a higher one than the one that was factored in. I'll maybe say a word about that in a minute. But you do so at a time and manner of your choosing, not of your opponent's choosing, and try to make sure that both sides understand how the escalation pattern works here, so you don't inadvertently get yourself into something very dangerous.
Further question? We'll get more questions from Jason and Alex, but let's see somebody know. Rosa, yeah.
Hi, my name is Rosette. Thank you again for being here. My question is about Zelensky's rhetoric towards NATO and towards joining NATO. I think mostly it has been towards joining NATO, but I wanted to know your thoughts on Zelensky's approach to that and whether that works in his favor, essentially.
Yeah. So Ukrainian politics, it's for someone who's spent so much time studying Russian politics, it's really hard to overstate just how different Ukraine is. And I think that was the heart actually of Putin's grotesque miscalculation in 2022. Just didn't get how different Ukraine was now is from Russia, and that led him into the blunders that he made. I think probably all I want to say on that is that it would be quite a big deal for a Ukrainian president in wartime to take off the table the policy goal of joining NATO. But I don't know any Ukrainians who seriously think this is going to happen anytime soon. I mean, it'd be quite a bad misreading of the signals if you did. For NATO to take it off the table, I think would be just catastrophic at this stage. It's a gigantic concession to the Russians. It feels to me like one of those questions you just park for the time being, just accept that Bucharest wasn't a great decision. There's nothing we can do about that, but at least don't make the thing worse. I think the much bigger questions for Zelensky now are around if he does get into some kind of ceasefire negotiation, it will be I don't think a peace negotiation. It's not possible with Putin. But basically, how much, if anything, is the Ukrainian public prepared to accept in order for the fighting to stop? I put to one side for the moment all this sort of goings on around corruption and all the rest of it. I mean, that seems to me to be two things. A, very bad, both in content and timing. B, very good, in that there is an actual reckoning taking place in Ukraine for quite very, very serious corruption. Just try to imagine anything comparable ever happening in Russia under Putin. Not going to happen. I'm not sure whether that really answers the question, but yeah. Well, I mean, just to reiterate the point, I don't think that there will be actual peace negotiations with Putin. I think there are ceasefire negotiations, but they're not the same thing. There's a fundamental difference between a ceasefire and a resolution of the conflict.
So since we have an online presence, there's an online question, and maybe I'll use that as the last question because we're running out of time. And the person who's asking an online question is asking whether we should humiliate Putin or not. I mean, do we have a capability or I think everybody would agree how wonderful it would be in an ideal world, but A, is it expedient? B, is it possible?
Wow, that's a question to end on. Purely personal answer. I'm now 3.5 years out of the Foreign Office, so I speak for only myself. I think be very, very careful what you wish for in this area. Certainly, I think Putin needs to lose his war in the sense that he needs to come out of this war not in control of Ukraine. That's achievable. With a broken army, that's achievable. With a broken economy, he's done to himself pretty much. and with diminished status on the world stage. I think that's pretty much inevitable. We haven't really discussed today the relationship between Russia and China, but I think that's one of the huge moving parts here. We've gone from a situation where the country that, in some respects, Russians fear even more than they fear the West, is now by miles the dominant partner in that relationship, and this will only go one way. So my message to the Kremlin is good luck. You brought it on yourselves. Don't blame us for it. You'll have to deal with the consequences of that. Humiliation of Putin. I mean, Putin will look after himself more or less. Humiliation of Russia and Russians. I'm immediately starting to think of 1918, 1919. What we want here is a lasting peace in Europe. That seems to me to be worth thinking about. What are the things that take you towards that, and what are the things that actually would take you back to war in maybe 5, 10, 15 years' time?
Well, thank you for that. That was a fantastic discussion. Laurie, thank you for sharing your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our speaker today, Sir Laurie Bristow. Great.